cut yesterday.
Okay.
Hi, thanks for joining me. I'm Mary Giuliano, and today my guest is George Wilson, and I think that a lot of people will recognize that name because your family's been here for decades.
Yeah, decades for sure. I was thinking on my way over here this morning, my great-grandfather, W.R. Wilson, was the president of the Crowsnest Coal Company in 1899.
Wow.
That's how far back the Wilsons have been, and residents of Fernie at that time.
Because that was kind of the beginning of Fernie.
The beginning of Fernie, and the beginning of, and of course, Fernie was founded on coal, and that's.
So would he have known William Fernie at the time? He would have, don't you think?
If he did, my father never ever spoke of that, but they were of that era, so I don't know how they couldn't have known of each other.
Right, because Fernie was named after William Fernie,
yes.
who was the founder, really, of coal.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And of course, there's that legend about him and the Indian maid.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
Do you know that legend, George?
Which results in the Ghost Rider?
Yeah.
Yes, yeah. I know the legend roughly, but probably not as good as some people in Fernie.
Well, tell me what it is.
Well, what I know is William Fernie ran into indigenous people in here, and they talked about the black rocks that burnt. And he had a education. He knew what the black rocks were, and that was coal, and I'm not sure how he got to be involved with, romantically involved with one of the females of the local native tribe, but he got himself, you might have to help me with this, Mary, but he got himself into a jam, it seems to me.
Because he promised to marry the
Yes.
princess.
Yes, and he didn't.
If
Yeah.
they told him where the coal was situated, he said he would marry the princess.
Oh, so they took him to the, okay, so
Yeah.
they showed him the outcrops of the
Right.
coal.
But
Oh,
as
yeah.
soon as he found out, he reneged on his promise.
Yeah.
However, he never did marry.
Ever?
Never.
Oh, okay.
So,
Yeah, no, you've got the history better than I do. Mary.
well, I've heard that legend many times, and another version of it is that he saw one of the chief's daughter was wearing a necklace of these black rocks,
Oh,
and he asked, "Where did you get these rocks?" And the Indian chief said, "Well, they're in such and such a place." And that's when he said, "I will marry your daughter if you show me where it is." But he didn't, and he found out where the coal was, and that's the legend to the shadow that's cast on Hosmer Mountain,
mm-hmm.
that shows a rider on a horse and a person walking beside, and they say that that's the Indian princess on the horse and the chief walking, because they were so upset, and that's
Right.
when they put the curse on Fernie.
Well, that's right. There was a curse,
Yeah,
and and then the fires occurred.
right. And you know, right now the First Nations people don't admit to anything like that. They say there's no such thing as them having put a curse, because they don't put curses. However, in 1964,
There was a ceremony.
there was a ceremony that had 3 chiefs in,
from the Tanaha.
in ceremonial
Mm-hmm.
headdresses. I remember the long ones because I was
Yeah.
a kid, and I remember watching it. And they smoked a peace pipe,
Mm-hmm.
and James White was the mayor,
Lifted the curse.
and they lifted the curse.
Yeah.
Now, really odd that in reality, things did get better for Fernie after they lifted the curse. And before that, we had the fires. Fernie burnt down in 1904 and 1908, with hardly anything left.
Mm-hmm.
We had floods.
1948.
Yeah, we had floods. We
Yeah.
had all kinds of terrible things happen. The city went into receivership in 1931, and they didn't have an elected a council until 1945. So Fernie really did suffer some bad times, and after the curse was lifted, things improved. So maybe it was a coincidence.
There you go. Yeah. Coincidentally, I'm a life member of the Fernie Rod and Gun Club, and the Fernie Rod and Gun Club was started in 1899. the Fernie Rod and Gun Club is the oldest fish and wildlife club in the BC Wildlife Federation.
I heard that.
And we celebrated our centennial, 100 years of being an organization in 1999.
Yeah, because I heard it was the first one in BC.
It's the oldest club in the Wildlife Federation.
Yeah, that's pretty amazing that it's still thriving and still going on.
It's an incredible club, recognized throughout the province. Yeah.
But let's get back to your family, because I'm really interested in the Wilsons, because I knew your mom and dad, but I didn't know your grandfather. Your grandfather was involved, but your dad was too in the mining.
My dad's grandfather was W.R. Wilson, was the president of the original coal company back at the end of the 1800s. His son, Stafford Wilson, died rather young, my father's dad. He had a serious accident, fatal accident, on the Lizard Creek Bridge. And I can't remember the year. I never knew my dad's father. I never met him. He died before I came into the... so my dad's greatest influence was his grandfather. And he's named after him. My dad's name was W.R. Wilson, same as his grandfather, yeah. So there's a bit of a gap in knowledge there. Like, I don't know what my dad's involvement was in the company, my dad's dad. But of course my father's involvement in the Crowsnest Pass Coal Company is well documented, and I know the history of it well from my beginnings back in the 50s when we lived in Sparwood. Right,
because you started out in Sparwood.
Yeah.
But then moved to Fernie.
Yeah, I've got a couple of older siblings, and we were in Sparwood in the 40s. That's when my mom and dad. Jesus, my dad was married when he was 33 years old. Anyway, sometime in the 40s they settled in Sparwood, and we moved to Fernie. My father, as I remember, my dad was involved with this. He was the manager of the sawmill, which was in Sparwood. Actually, between Sparwood and Natal was where the sawmill was.
Right, because they own the sawmill as well as the...
They had the logging side and the coal mining side.
Yeah.
Underground coal mining and logging. And logging was probably a bigger part of their business than coal mining at that time. And I'm not sure of the year exactly, but 67 or 68, 1967 or 68, the company decided to move the sawmill to Alco.
Oh,
and they tore the sawmill down in Natal and built this brand new state-of-the-art mill in Alco. And a number of families from Sparwood moved to Fernie at that time.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
That was before even the towns themselves were moved.
Well, of course, the history of Michelle and Natal being dismantled and people being forced to relocate to Sparwood is fairly well known. And that was, I think, in the earlier 60s, slightly earlier than when we moved to Fernie, because most of those families were already relocated to Sparwood, as I remember when we moved.
Coal Creek was also part of the mines that were owned by the original.
Yes. Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think back to the disasters, and my great-great-grandfather was dealing with those as the president of the coal company. I can't imagine how that impacted him. I mean, I've been in management all my life, but he was at a very senior level, and
because in 1922, I believe, or was it 1902? I know I can't remember exactly. They had the huge explosion at Coal Creek, where between 132 and 134 men were killed, including some young ones that were only 12 and 14 years old. I remember I was able to get Tech to pay for bricks to put in front of the Miners' Walk.
Right.
And they did, and I had 133 names, although some people say it was 134, but the museum had 134 names.
Mm-hmm. That Miners Walk is interesting. You know where all the rock came from that's around the miners?
Oh, I know where it came from, George. I phoned you and said, George, we need some rocks.
And Fred Lightfoot and I, we go back so far that when Fred and I got together, we had no problem making that work. It looks awesome, by the way.
Oh, and not only that, but you brought all the rocks and you donated them.
Oh, yeah.
You donated the work to bring them, get them. Thank you, George.
No.
I was going to mention that.
It was the whole idea of recognizing our history of mining. Anything I could ever do to be help.
And that was the only thing, really, in Fernie that recognizes mining. And
yes.
It started because Helen and Mary Bachelet came to City Council and said, you had this celebration of 100 years of Fernie in 2004, and there was absolutely nothing mentioned about mining. And they said, this is not right. Our father worked in the mine, and we need to have something. Mm-hmm. So they had started a committee with about 20 people, and it had filtered down to only about 6. And they hadn't really gotten anywhere. And so they came to council asking for assistance. And they said, we want a councillor to join us. And nobody volunteered. So I put up my hand. And that's how I got involved. Mm-hmm. And I was able to bring in some different people, and we actually made things happen to what that ended up being just a few $100s short of a $500,000 project.
Oh yeah.
Because a lot of work was done underneath to level the earth, and we put water pipes in there too, so that you could water the grass and the flowers, and and we put electrical, so we could have lights, and it was we thought it would be a small project, but it ended up being a huge project.
Right.
But well worth it. It was one of the best things I ever worked on.
Of course,
I totally coordinated it and had a ton of people that helped out.
I wonder how many people, when they see the Miners Walk, can relate to the building that's there and its relationship to coal mining in this.
Well, that was the very first office for the Crowsnest Coal Company.
You betcha.
And it's so historical.
Yeah.
And there's a plaque in the front on the left side that talks about how when Shell owned it, when they left, they donated it to the city of Fernie for $2. And so it's a really beautiful, majestic building.
Yes.
It's
sure is.
Very appropriate for a city hall.
Yeah. Other municipalities would love to have.
Oh yeah, but your dad must have worked in there a long time.
Oh, he did. Yeah. Well, actually, his offices were always at the sawmills. His office was at the Sparwood sawmill, which I spent some time in his office with him there when I was a kid, and he had an office in Elko. And then he got promoted, or his job changed to land manager. And when he became the land manager, that was with Shell, by the way. He moved into that office. He moved into the building where City Hall is today.
Because I remember him in there.
And he worked in there to his retirement. Yeah.
He also was a councillor for a couple of terms as well.
He did 2 terms, a very popular councillor, which surprised me and probably my siblings, my brothers and sisters as well. I would have never thought he would ever get into municipal politics. He was so obstinate at times that I didn't think people would see the side of him where he could be the management side of him, but they obviously did.
However, I voted for your dad both times because I knew of the work he was doing, and so I believe that in town he held a lot of respect.
He obviously did.
He held great respect for the work he was doing.
Yeah, his numbers come election time were.
He did.
If he didn't lead the polls, he was right up there. Yeah, he did 2 terms, and it was trying on him, very trying on him, and there were people that were trying to talk him into running for mayor. There was quite a movement. I can recall that. My mother telling me. he wouldn't have any part of it.
I can understand why.
I'm sure you
gone
can.
through that now. Yeah. But still, it's you know, as I said, your family, your mom and dad had such great respect. I would like to also talk about your mom, but first we'll take a little break.
Okay.
So we were talking about your dad. Where was your dad born?
I'm not great on dates, but I know this for the weirdest reason. My father was born in 1914. Dr. East was born in 1912. And they were very good friends.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, we lived kitty corner to each other
Right.
for a time in Fernie. And I remember a time at the house in the North End when my mom and dad moved. And both Dr. East and my dad were elderly in their years. I'm not sure how old, but they were at least in their 70s. And they were sitting together on the couch and talking, and they were they were having not a competition, but my dad said, "Can you still do this, doctor, without help?" And Dr. East, "Yes, I can." And they were in their late 70s without having to get help to get up.
Right.
I was just sitting there watching this, and I thought, "Oh boy, I can't wait till I get to that age where that's the mark."
Yeah, exactly.
But it was neat to watch, and they go back. Interestingly, Dr. East, my mother, gave birth to 9 lovely children. There were 9 kids in our family, and they were all born. Though we lived in Sparwood, I'm pretty sure all of the kids were born in Fernie. And delivered by Dr. East. And delivered by Dr. East at the Park Place, where the Park Place is now.
Yeah.
That hospital. I may be wrong with my older brother and sister. One or two of them, they might have been born in the hospital in Michelle, but I don't think so. I think all of the kids were delivered by Dr. East in Fernie.
Fernie.
Yeah.
Yes, he delivered over 2,000 children.
Yeah.
Including my 4.
and my children as well.
Yeah, he delivered a lot of children.
Yeah.
So anyway, was your dad born in a town, Michelle?
My dad was born in Fernie.
In Fernie?
Yeah, my dad had a family of 3. WR, my dad, his brother Stafford, and his sister Catherine. And Catherine married a very well-known lawyer in Fernie. I'm going to forget his first name. His last name was Herkimer. And
Herkimer, no kidding. He was on council too, because I see his name.
Way back. You betcha. Way back. He was a very prominent name in Fernie. They divorced before my time, and they separated, but Catherine had 2 children. Yeah, 2 children. Barbara and Billy. Yeah.
But they didn't live here in Fernie?
They never did live in Fernie. When I knew my Auntie Kath, she lived in Calgary, and her kids they never did live in Fernie. And Mr. Herkimer, my dad went to visit Mr. Herkimer by train, and after his retirement, he went by train to Toronto.
That's where he moved
he
to.
He was in Toronto.
He looked like a very stately gentleman in the photographs.
Yeah.
And of course, the old photos of people on council were so serious.
Yes.
Nobody smiling, everybody really serious expressions. But I remember that name.
Yeah, it's an old Fernie name, for sure.
Did they have a street named after him? Maybe not.
I don't know.
Because there was Pellet. That was named after somebody that was on council.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, it seems to me there's something named after the Herkimer family, because I've seen it somewhere, but it's probably a street. Yeah.
So your dad and him were
really close.
Really close.
Even though there was a separation, a divorce they stayed very close. Yeah. Good friends. Bill Prentice, he was of that era as well, and he was a good friend of the 3 of them.
And actually, all 3 of those men and Dr. East were quite instrumental in the way Fernie became and what was accomplished. I mean, you look at Prentice, we've got Prentice Park named after him.
Yeah, I don't know, I won't remember the year Bill Prentice passed, but it was early as far as I'm concerned. He didn't live as long as my father did, but my father, with the help of Vince Knowles and Johnny Audio, were very instrumental in getting Prentice Park named as it is and putting that rock there. They picked that rock out off when you turn down Highway 93 underneath Rabbit Mountain, that rock was there. And C&I, Crowsnest Industries at the time, which had the sawmill at Elko, they used 2 huge loaders, lifted that rock up and loaded it on a low bed that Johnny Press drove. And Johnny Press hauled that rock there. And when he pulled the grade up the Elko Hill, he said that rock weighs 40 tons. It weighs the same weight as a D8 cat, because that's the gear I have to pull that hill with a D8 cat on. That's how they got the weight of it.
I often wondered how they got that humongous rock over there.
That's how they got it there. Yeah. And those 3 individuals, Bernard Audi and I talk about it a lot, about that big job, getting that rock there to honor Bill Prentice. And,
because his dad, John Audia, was very
he
well
owned the
known
trucking
too.
company.
Yeah, he was
and
so
Vince,
well known.
Vince and Johnny actually were partners in Fernie Contractors back in the day.
That's something I didn't know.
When Kaiser first came here in the late 60s, there was a company called Fernie Contractors, and they were the biggest contracting dirt movers in the area, local dirt movers.
And of course, you know, Knowles became really well known, but John Audia died when he was fairly young.
Yeah, yes.
And so his name, he kind of, you know, his name wasn't as well known, but Knowles really did well.
Yeah, and I became really close to the Knowles family. Vince's oldest daughter, Vince Knowles' oldest daughter, was my wife's best friend.
Barb.
Barb. Through school. And when I finished my schooling, one of my first real job was Vince Knowles. He hired me, and he trained me on a dozer. And I worked for Vince for 10 years, and I got to know the family really well, got to know the business really well, and I owe a pile to him trusting me to take me on as a kid and run some of the iron. He had over, at one point he had over 70 pieces of Caterpillar equipment.
Wow.
Yeah.
He was quite the guy. When did he lose his arm? Do you know?
As I know how he lost it. He was driving a truck. I believe it was a lumber truck, and he had his left arm out. Somehow his left arm was out when the vehicle rolled, and that's how he lost his arm. That's how he injured it, and that's how he lost it. So he only had his right. But
what he did with that right hand, you know, he could
it's legendary what he could do.
10 men.
Yeah. He was incredibly strong with that one arm.
I always found him a really interesting person, and at the end when he was on dialysis, I was especially happy that I had worked so hard to get the dialysis unit, and I wanted it in Fernie, and you know, that started because my own child was on dialysis and she was living in Calgary, and I wanted her home on weekends, but she couldn't because she had to dialyze Monday, Wednesdays, Fridays, and then in the winter, especially if the roads were closed, which sometimes they are, she had to be there for Monday for dialysis, so we never could have her home in the winter. And so I found out through this man who had lobbied to get a unit in Invermere, a rich oil man, whose wife was dialyzing next to my daughter in Calgary, and he told me that he had a summer home in Invermere, and he'd gotten a unit in Invermere, and I said, how did you do that? And he goes, well, you just lobby the government, you lobby the medical people, and I thought, I can do that. And so I did, but I did it in a different way than he did because I didn't have connections. Do you remember Doreen Nee?
Doreen Lee?
Nee? She was married to
I know the Nee
Cervello, to not Tony. Oh, what was the other brother? They had 2 sons. One lives in Fernie and one lives in Calgary. But she was married to a Cervello, and I can't think of his name right now. But Doreen was a school teacher who had diabetic and had lost her kidneys and was having to make those 3 trips a week to Fort Macleod to dialyze.
Oh.
And her husband, after years, her husband got sick and he died from cancer. And so her son, who was reclusive, had to drive her, and several times in the winter they hit black ice and they almost had, you know, severe accidents. And so I asked Doreen if I could do a story on her, and I brought in, I did a story actually for the Free Press, and then I took that story and sent it to Global and to CTV in Calgary, Lethbridge, and Vancouver. And they came and they did an actual story on her on video. So when I had that and the story, then I started lobbying Erda Walsh, who at the time was the MLA.
You betcha.
And it was an election year. And so I was at her constantly. And I also had asked Doreen's niece, Colleen, and I can't remember her last name either, but she still lives in Fernie. So the 2 of us also went before council, and we got letters of support. And between all these letters and all the stuff, and being an election year, they said okay. But they said we will do it at the Fernie, at the Sparwood Hospital. So I said, hey, Sparwood is better than nothing. And actually, when they did implement the machines, they invited Colleen and me to go and cut the ribbon, and we made the front page. But I doubt I never ended up using it because she got a kidney. But what was really amazing was that Vince Knowles was using it, going back and forth, and Jackie Clark, and I can't tell you how many people now that I've known have been using that so that they don't have to go to Trail,
Right.
whether before they have to go either for Macleod or Trail, and Trail is even further away.
Yeah. Coincidentally, 3 days ago, I'm very deep in the Flathead, deer hunting. I run into an old friend that I knew had been going through some serious health issues. I didn't know the details of the issues, but he was he lived in the Elk Valley. Joya is his last name. And so we met on the road, and I said, good to see you out. I said, I heard you were really ill. He says, yeah, kidneys. Both my kidneys are out right now. I'm on dialysis. He says, today I'm in the Flathead, tomorrow I'm in the Sparwood dialysis.
Oh.
And very optimistic. I think there is a future there. But
Oh yeah, you can live for a long time in dialysis.
Coincidentally, you just bringing that up, and I run into this guy that's using that same dialysis machine.
Yeah, well, it's just been amazing. I'm so glad that I did that. I started out with a personal reason. It didn't work out, but it worked out for others.
Yeah, oh, for sure.
You're
right. Travel out of this valley in the wintertime is...
It's terrible. It was terrible
treacherous.
for Doreen to have to go back and forth. Yeah. But I was going to talk about your mother as well. Your mother was born in Cranbrook, because I did a couple of stories on your mother, and I knew her really well from CWL, the Church Women's Group at the Catholic Church. And also, there was a group of ladies that included Mrs. Wozniak, Mrs. Calger, Mrs. Hovend, Mrs. Webster, and your mother.
Dora Anderson?
Maybe Dora. But there was at least 10 ladies that used to get together for tea in the afternoons once a week or so. And I don't know how, but I ended up getting invited, which they were all older than me, but I loved it because they were such grand ladies. And I mean, you know how elegant your mother was in the way she carried herself and her manners and in the clothes. She always looked like a queen.
Yeah.
And the other ladies looked pretty good too.
Yeah.
you know. But I then started taking the turn at my house, and I've always loved fancy china, so I had plenty of that, and I had the tablecloths, and I could bake, so I was invited every now and then to their afternoon teas.
I don't remember my mother being involved in those teas, but
oh, you were a boy.
Yeah, yeah. And she did have a very social life.
She did, and she was just great. Yeah, she was just a really lovely person. One thing about her is that she told me she was a convert to Catholicism.
Mm-hmm.
She was a strong Catholic.
My father was the Catholic, she wasn't. And when they married, she had to convert.
But she was very, very strong Catholic.
Very strong.
And did a lot for the church.
Very strong Catholic,
yeah,
yes.
Yeah, and could be seen just really, really great to have known her. And we're just going to take a bit of a break. So let's go back to your family. There are 6 generations that have been in Fernie, that have called Fernie home.
Yes, we just kind of came to that realization here, going back to my great-great-grandfather back in 1899, and then his son Stafford, and then his son W.R. Jr., and then I'm the family of W.R. Jr., and then my son and daughter, and then their children. There's 6 generations.
6 generations.
Yeah. And what I'm extremely proud of is my family has worked in the natural resource industry from 1899 till today.
Is your son also?
My son is a coal miner, and my son-in-law is a coal miner. We've either worked in the bush, or in the mines, or in the oil and gas. It's always been in the natural resource sector. Very proud of it too.
So what did you start with? You started working in the mines?
Myself? When I left school, interestingly, I started work for the Department of Highways. Least fan when I started with the Department of Highways on almost the same day. And I worked there for a few months, realized that that wasn't cut out for me, and I went on to be a coal miner. Interestingly, Lee stayed there till retirement.
Yeah, he did.
You choose your paths. But I wound up in the dirt moving business, and I always loved equipment. And like I said earlier, Vince Knowles brought me in to his construction group. And I worked there for 10 years, and then Shell Resources came in here, and I saw a better future for my family in the mining. So I put out, anyway, Shell hired me when they were starting up the Lion Creek coal mine in 1980, and I went to work there in 1980, and I worked there till my retirement in 2012.
Yeah, because I knew you were over there. But don't you also have your own private company?
I started a drill blast company in 1996, Wilson Drill and Blast Service. And I've always, even when I was a kid, I've always loved and been interested in blasting. And when I got old enough, I was able to actually get my own blasting ticket and get licensed and actually do it. And so I've got an interesting history in blasting. Some of the things that I've been asked to blow up. I blew up a cabin on Castle Mountain for Crestbrook. Because it was a squatter's cabin, and they couldn't burn it because it was in a dead forest, a jack pine, a bug-killed forest. So they brought me up there and asked if I could blow it up. They put notices on it, told the squatters to bail, and so we did a great job. We blew that cabin up. There was nothing left when it was done. Anyway, when I started the business in '96, my objective was to try to keep a business afloat that would provide some kind of income and something for me to do when I retired. I always wanted to retire fairly early, which I did. I retired on my 60th birthday, and my plan worked, which surprised a lot of people, including me. I still had the company when I retired, and since I've retired, it's done extremely well. We've had some disasters and floods since 2012 in this part of the province and southeastern Alberta. and my quarry has supplied rock for throughout that whole region,
Wow.
for highways and railways and gas lines. And
You didn't really retire, George.
well,
You just retired from different jobs.
what I say to people, because I hear that a lot, but what I say to people now, every day I do what I want to do every day. Back when you full-time job, you may not want to go to work every day.
Exactly.
That's not the same. Now that I'm retired, I go do what I want every day, and I love it. And I don't work that steady. People think I do, but I don't. I don't work that steady.
You look really young.
Yeah, and I think that keeps you young.
Oh yeah, definitely keeping some kind of interest in your life keeps a person young.
Aside from work, I mean, I'm a life member of the Fernie Rod and Gun Club. I was a board member in the BC Wildlife Federation for 19 years.
Boy.
I was the president of the BC Wildlife Federation from 2014 to 2016, which was probably the most stressful management job that I've ever been in. And it's a volunteer job, like, and I mean totally volunteer. Very, very. It's a huge undertaking, and I was glad when my term came.
How long was your term? Because
it's a 2-year term. Oh, it's actually it's a 1-year term, and you can only serve 2. And in the history of the Wildlife Federation, which dates back to 1957, I think there's only been 1 or 2 presidents that have only done 1-year terms. Everybody's had to do 2, and I did 2. Yeah.
Oh, that's good. But I think I remember coming to one of your conventions here.
Yeah, I remember as well.
It seemed to me like you were highly respected.
Yeah, well, I was there a long time, and you deal with some interesting things in an organization like that.
Oh, for sure. And I think that when people from those types of organizations respect you, that means so much more than anybody.
Yeah.
You know, I was talking to a lot of different strangers, and they all knew who you were, and they all had kind things to say about you.
Yeah. Well, you get involved, like I was involved with the Wildlife Federation through New Democrat governments, Social Credit governments, Liberal governments, all provincial, and you have to work with
them all.
Regardless of what your own personal political stripe might be, you have to work with them, and we found ways. I didn't have the greatest relationship with our local MLA when the New Democrats were in power, but the New Democrat MLA for Columbia Kootenay, Jim Doyle, turned out to be a great ally for us with the BC Wildlife Federation, and I think back to those great days. A good friend of mine, Andy Pesderick, lived in Golden, and he made that contact for me. So there's always ways, even.
Well, I know Bill Bennett certainly thought highly of you.
Yeah, well, I was, and vice versa. I mean, I knew Bill when he was long before he was a politician, and we had a mutual love of hockey, junior hockey, and that's where I met him. Was at the Cranbrook Arena watching the Kootenay Ice. Bob Fontana and I, we bought season tickets to help get that team into Cranbrook, and that's how I met Bill at that time.
I also was thinking that I'm sorry that Marilyn, your wife, couldn't make it today, because she has a long history in Fernie as well. Hasn't her family been here for a long time as well?
Her mother's maiden name was Tully, and Albert Tully was the father. They lived in West Fernie, and there were 3 daughters in the family. Mary was the oldest, then Bessie, then Doris. And do you remember them? Doris Kendall.
Yes.
Mary Mattisdorfer.
Yeah.
And of course Bessie Wilczuk. And tragically, Bessie's husband and her sister's husband drowned in 1966 in Edwards Lake.
I remember that so clearly.
2 brother-in-laws, and tragic.
I was young, but I remember feeling so sad over it. I didn't even know them, but it just sounded like such a tragic event.
Yeah, and Bessie did eventually move on, and she remarried, and she married Dan Kubis. And Bessie had 2 more children to Dan, and it's made for a really a neat family. The Wilczek. Bessie had four kids. Martin was the oldest, then Marilyn, and then the twins, Wayne and Elaine.
I didn't realize there were twins.
Yeah, they were twins.
Ah.
Yeah, you betcha.
And which sister lost the husband? Which others was Bessie and which sister?
Mary Mattisdorfer. She lost her husband.
Oh, it was Mary that lost her
Mary
husband.
lost. Yeah, it was, and his name was Charlie.
Just like the son.
Just like the son.
Oh.
I think the oldest son. Yeah, and then like Charlie and Mary live in the North End right now, and they have a son, Charlie.
Yeah. So that name has been carrying on.
Yeah, they carried the name on, just like the WR stays in our family.
And she never ever remarried, did she?
Oh, yes, she did.
Did she?
Yes, she did. She married George McNaughton.
Oh, that's right.
And she had a child, Adam, who works for the city at times.
Oh, so he is a brother to Charlie, a half-brother to Charlie.
Yes.
Oh, okay. I thought they were cousins for some reason.
No.
Oh, he's a half-brother.
Yes. And then she ended up in a third relationship with Mary did with I'm having a brain crack. Last name Bronson, Lyle Bronson.
Ah.
Yeah.
I don't recognize that name.
No, real character, and we spent a lot of time with them camping. Mary loved being outdoors, and so did Lyle. And of course, my family did too, so we spent a lot of time together.
I know Bessie was a good friend to Rosa de la Siega,
Mm-hmm.
and when she passed away, Rosa just really missed her because they just lived like down the street.
Yeah.
And Rosa would say, well, as soon as I saw Bessie outside, I knew I could go out there, and we would sit there and we would talk for hours sitting outside in the summer.
Celia Yushko lived kitty corner, and Rosa was over there, and Mrs. Bella was there.
Yeah.
It was a real group, tight group.
It's too bad there's nobody from the Bella family in town left.
Yeah.
Because Margaret passed away.
You're right. And
she was
I used to speak to her. I was going to say 102.
Yeah.
I used to speak to her at the home when I was in there with my mom, and amazing. She was really close to 100 then, and she looked and sounded.
At her 100th birthday party, she was dressed so beautiful. She did not look 100, and she had her, all her faculties, and she was just. She had her, she sat up straight, and she had this beautiful party, and I couldn't get over how wonderful she was. I thought, golly, I hope when I'm 80, I'm like that. Never mind 100.
Exactly.
Exactly. But the Bellas, I mean, there was a lot of them too. That was one great family. I still keep in touch with Peggy, who I went to school with, and she lives on a boat close to Fiji.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, when she retired, that's where she went. She just sailing the world.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, but she did come to Fernie last summer, and I got to see her and her cousin Carmen. It was really lovely.
Yeah.
But really, now that Margaret's gone, there's no Bellas left.
Right.
And that was quite a known name for so many years, because I think there was like 10 or 12 children.
Yeah. Do you know there's a Bella, one of the daughters, married a Kennelly in Cranbrook?
In Cranbrook.
And she must still be.
Yeah, I think she must be close to 80.
The Kennellys were good friends of my mom and dad.
Oh, were they?
Yeah.
They were at that party. That's how I met them.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
For Margaret.
He had his own construction company.
Yeah, and he's well known in Cranbrook.
Yes.
Really well known.
Yeah.
He might have been on council as well.
He might have been.
Yeah.
I can't believe I remembered that name. My memory is getting so terrible, but it popped into my head there. Mr. Connell. I remember his face and everything, but sometimes names don't.
Well, I always remember the old names in Fernie that were prominent, like Dickon, Telford Dix and Bud Dickon and even the guy that had the drugstores. Oh my gosh, I know his name, and I can see his face, and I can't think of his name. I don't know if you remember him. He used to sell insurance as well, but he had the drugstores.
I bet if Marilyn was here, she'd know.
Mm-hmm.
See, it's funny, me coming to Fernie in the late 60s, Marilyn knows so much more of the history in Fernie than I do, just because she was here longer.
Now, you know, Fernie's changed, right? I mean, but we've seen change come and go. It cycles, right?
Mm-hmm.
What is the biggest change that you've noticed?
Well, for the change I've noticed, and it's just natural, is I don't know anybody anymore when I go uptown. I just don't know anybody. And 20 years ago, if I saw somebody I didn't know, it was
Yeah.
a surprise. But now, and functions, I read the paper and people are involved, and it's nobody's fault. That's just what it is. And I'm not involved. I'm not very. My wife and I are not very socially involved either. So you don't meet people, but things evolve, and it's just Fernie's got a lot of new faces, and I would say there's nothing wrong with that, and there's been a lot of positive come out of it, Mary. I'm sure you've seen that too.
I remember when we got all the fast food places, how people were saying, "Oh, why do we don't need those?" But what I did notice was all the complaints were coming from the newer people. And I remember being in a group of people and saying to them, listen, us people that were raised here or born and raised here and had nothing, we appreciate those places.
Yeah.
Understand this.
Libby's.
You're coming from the big places and you want Fernie to remain small, but we who have always lived here without, we appreciate that.
Yeah,
I don't know if they ever understood that.
Yeah.
Mm. Now, if I can just go back to talking about Claire, your lovely mother. She has a brother here who's in the home that I've met a couple of times.
Yep, brother Jack.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, he's the last remaining. There were 3 in the family. Art was the oldest, then Claire, then Jack.
I remember when the first time I met him was at your mother's 90th birthday party.
Oh yeah.
We had it in the hall at, Fernie Family Center next to our church.
I remember it well. I gave a little bit of a speech there, and somebody's captured a little bit of one of the parts that I enjoyed the most on video, where I said the reason my mother looks so good at 90 is because her kids were so well behaved and never ever got in any kind of trouble.
And I wrote a story and I quoted you on that. And I knew you were saying that tongue in cheek.
Oh boy, was that tongue in cheek. And I looked at my mother as I said that, and she was just, she got quite a kick out of it.
Oh, I'm sure she did. She would have definitely got that. But I also remember what else she said when she got up to say thank you. Because the hall was full of people. Mm-hmm. Oh my gosh, there was hundreds there. And she said, I never knew I had this many friends.
Yes.
And I think she really meant it.
She did mean it.
She never realized the impact she had on people, the positive impact she had on people, because she was so gracious.
Yeah.
She was such a gracious, lovely person.
Yeah, and I don't know how she came by that. She was, as you mentioned earlier, I think she was born in Cranbrook, but she had an interesting childhood. Her father, Ora Taplin, he worked in the logging business, and my mother spent a lot of time in logging camps in Canal Flats and in and around Yak, and she spoke often about those times with great humor.
No water, no heat, nothing.
She never ever spoke negatively about it. She loved it.
It was always matter of fact.
Yeah, and then she eventually got back to Cranbrook, to city life, and I think she got her schooling there. She actually was named the Carnival Queen in Cranbrook for the city of Cranbrook. I'm not going to get the year right, but I've got pictures of her getting crowned on the ice, And if you saw that picture, and if you put it in color, you'd swear it was my sister Annabelle. The resemblance is incredible. But my mother had a good friend, I'm not going to remember her maiden name, but Ann Prentice.
Yes.
And my mother were really close friends in Cranbrook, and they double dated, and I think that's how my mom and dad got together. They were it was a blind date. The Prentice, Bill Prentice and Ann were together. They were a group or a couple, and that's how my mom and dad met, through them. And the rest is...
Yes, I knew that they were very good friends.
Yeah, yeah.
Unfortunately, Mrs. Prentice died kind of young.
Right. Bill first, and then Ann. Ann was later, and yeah, they were. That was my father's best friend, and it was his boss too, I guess, because Bill was the president of the coal company.
Yeah, he ended up being the president.
My father was a manager at different levels. So, yeah.
Oh, did your dad know Mr. Woods, Trites, or Mr. Trites? Because who built the LaRue mansion? It was Trites, I think, not, or was it Wood, or was it both?
I don't know. My father, I don't know, but
he might have been gone by then.
Yeah, yeah.
But probably his father, and certainly his grandfather knew.
Yeah.
Would have known him really well.
Our house was next door to the LaRue mansion, and
yes,
Mr. LaRue and his wife Georgie were really good friends. Actually, Georgie and my sister Annabelle developed a very, very close relationship right till Georgie's passing. Yeah. Yeah, those were the days. The doctors in Fernie, 2 doctors, Dr.
Remember
LaRue and
Dr.
Dr.
LaRue?
East.
Yeah,
the LaRue Clinic and the East Clinic.
And Dr. McCritchie at one time.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Where the building that is now being converted to a roaster cafe, where they roast coffee. But it used to be the Nova Scotia Bank, and before that it was the optical place. But at one time, that was, when I was a child, that was the clinic. And in the clinic was Dr. Berg, Dr. McCritchie, and Dr. East.
Okay.
And that would have been 53, 54, 55, 56, like the 50s and 60s. I always remember Dr. McCritchie as well.
Yeah. Well, my mom, something that is mind-boggling to me, and when I think back on it, is my mother raising all these children. There were, over the period, the oldest in our family is Stafford, and he lives in Burmis, Alberta right now. Right now, he's been there forever. My brother Staff, he left school early. I don't remember what grade he was in, but he left school early and went to work at the sawmill in Sparwood. The sawmill went on strike. He decided he couldn't not work, so he hitchhiked to Alberta. He was looking for work, and a guy picked him up. This is a true story, but he got a job in Alberta when he was just a kid, and he's never come back to British Columbia.
Really? Well, he married a BC girl.
He married a
Fernie girl.
He married a Bodine from Fernie.
Yeah,
but
Anne, right?
Yeah, Anne Bodine, you betcha. Yeah, and Staff's lived in Alberta ever since. He's a true Albertan. Anyway, I forget where I was going with that, Mary, when we got off on that topic with Stafford.
Well, you were talking about your mum as well.
Right.
But, to give credit to your mother, 9 children?
Well, that's where I was going with. Is the summer vacation, we had a we had a cabin on Grave Lake. We had a cottage we built it. It was our cottage. And it had no running water. It had an outside outhouse, as they all did. But I have these memories of my father hauling us up there in the summer in July, and he'd drop us off, and then he would go home and work out of the house. He would work at the sawmill, and he might come up to the lake once a week or something like that. But my mother had all these kids, and usually one or two in diapers, and that was her summer vacation, and she loved it.
Although she told me there was no amenities
There was-
whatsoever.
oh, no. It
She
had
was
to be-
carting water.
It had to be incredible work. I mean,
Yeah.
she had lots of boys. There were 6 boys in her family, so the bulwark could always be done. But still, what a vacation! When I think today, if somebody was put in that position.
One thing about your mother, she never complained.
No, she did not. No, she didn't complain.
It-
She found positive. She always tried to find something
Yeah,
positive.
she was really quite an amazing person.
Yeah, yeah. She set quite an example for us kids.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And true, I mean, if we can talk about it, I mean, some of your siblings had some rough times.
Mhm.
So your mother went through some very,
Oh, very
sad,
Yeah.
tremendously worrisome times.
Yeah, we lost
But-
our brother in 1988 to
Is that when it was, 1988?
Yeah, my brother Patrick was, in my,
Yeah.
the word I use is murdered, though that's not the way the courts ruled it, but I'll never forget how my mother handled that. Her religion,
Yeah,
her belief in
yeah,
the,
belief in the God, her
yeah,
faith really carried her through.
Yeah, yeah. And then we lost my brother Michael way too soon, and
Mhm.
my mother had to deal with that.
Yeah, I mean, your mother had to deal with 2 huge losses
Yeah.
that would throw any woman down, okay?
Yeah.
But she just seemed to carry it with grace. That's probably why people admired her so much,
Yeah.
because she had that grace to carry herself through regardless of what she went
Yeah.
through.
I do believe that.
Yeah, she was
Yeah.
tremendous. Yeah, I think of her often.
Yeah. Yeah. We all do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so between you and Marilyn, you've had both have had tragedies in your lives.
Yes,
And you're
yeah.
able to keep moving forward.
Yeah.
And,
Yeah.
Mhm.
I mean, Marilyn's lost 2 brothers, and her family is extremely close. Her family, when I see the dynamics of her family and my family and how they interact, it is night and day. Her family, if they don't speak almost on a daily basis, there's something wrong.
Hmm.
My family, if we speak annually, it's all good, and it works.
Yeah.
It's just that her family is extremely close. They know what's going on in each other's lives, literally hour to hour, and it's kind of neat for me being married into that and seeing how that works versus my family.
Yeah, well, everybody's different.
Yeah, yeah, for
You know,
sure.
my 2 sisters and my brother have moved away, and I think about them often, but I'm busy and I don't pick up the phone as often as I could,
Mhm, mhm.
and neither do they.
Yeah.
But yet, we still feel like we're close
Yeah.
because we get together once a year, and it's just the way it is.
And I'm sure you know of families, because I know of families where there are siblings that don't speak and haven't spoken in years, and they carry it to their grave. So
And that I don't understand.
neither do
Yeah.
I, and there's nothing even close to that in either of our families. Like even like my family, where we don't see each other very often, you grow up with a family of 9, you develop some interesting bonds, and like I say, night and day between the way the 2 families interact, but it works.
Yeah, it's one thing with our family is if we hear that one of us is not feeling well, we're there, and we're phoning every day until somebody gets feeling well again.
Yeah.
And then afterwards we just let it go for a bit again, it's because, but where you're there when somebody needs you.
I just thought of something, Mary. You would remember this, I bet. Marilyn's father, Martin, though he passed in '66, he had a franchise with Beaver Lumber.
I was just going to bring that up.
He was a carpenter by trade.
Yeah.
And I never got to meet Martin Wilczek. It's one of the saddest things in my life, not ever meeting this guy. he had to be an incredible, a real character, because some of the people like Clifford Kendall Sr., he tells me stories about, because he was a brother-in-law, and he must have been, anyway, I would have loved to have known him.
I remember when they had Beaver Lumber, where the property is that is taken over by the Rocky Mountain Clinic, and behind it,
and across the alley,
where Quality for Less used to be at one time. Yeah, that was all Beaver Lumber.
Yeah.
Until it was purchased and moved out on the highway.
Really interesting. When my dad modified, he hired a carpenter to modify that house that they bought on 4th Avenue, or 3rd Avenue in the North End.
Yeah,
you know where they lived there? On 4th?
Right behind me.
Yeah, right behind you. When they were adding on to that, they took a wall out, and in the wall, they found this carpenter's pouch, Wilczuk's Building Supplies.
No kidding.
And of course, the guy doing the work said, "Do you know this family?" And my dad said, "Oh, quite well." So we have that. The carpenter, Marilyn's dad, Wilczuk's Building Supplies. Yeah.
A couple of weeks ago, I got a memory popping up on my Facebook page, and it was 3 photos of Wayne Wilczuk, and I had taken them, I guess, years ago, and they popped up, and so I posted them, and I said, this guy was such a great guy, I have to repost these because it's a beautiful memory, and I had a lot of responses. People remembered.
Wasn't that something, his service in the community center?
Huge. The community center was full.
We knew that Wayne had made friends huge. So when we had to deal with his passing and where to hold the service, we thought, we better have a big venue, and so we decided, and it was a bit risky because the last thing you want, are we running out of time?
No.
Oh, the last thing you want is to not have an partially empty building. Yeah. Well, we sure didn't have to deal with that.
It was full, right to the...
It was full.
People were standing, there wasn't enough chairs.
There were 600 people at that.
Yeah, I thought it was more.
Yeah,
because it was so packed.
What a beautiful service.
It was.
Yeah.
Because he was such a lovely man.
Yeah, he sure was. Yeah, miss him every day.
Yeah, he was a really great guy. Yeah, there's so many lovely people in this world that, are gone, that lived in Fernie. And it's true what you said about Fernie changing in the fact that there's so many new people. But I'm thinking that in 1958, when the Coal Creek shut down, and then there was a huge influx of people that did come back when Kaiser took over, that there was a lot of new people, and a lot of those old people must have said, "Gee, we don't know anybody. And sure. So now there's a whole batch of newer people, and here we are saying the same thing. But I certainly appreciate the fact that you came and you talked about some of the old times.
Yeah.
George, I appreciate it so much.
I really enjoyed it, Mary.
Thank you.
I was a little nervous how this was going to go.
Oh gosh, no, you're just talking to me. Thank you.
Did a great job keeping me on track.
Oh no, we could have.
Like my father was,
or the mill, or whatever he was involved with.
Well, we touched on him being involved. Yeah, I think we did.
Yeah, you think
we talked about the mill in Sparwood. He was the mill manager, and his office was in Sparwood at the sawmill. And then they moved in '68 to Elko, and he was the mill manager there. And he moved with the mill along with the Backens, and
yeah, that's what we didn't bother to mention, because I like mentioning some of the old names that people would. I remember the Backens so well.
Yeah.
Jim and
Ed.
Ed.
Yeah. Ed and.
What was her name? I know her so well.
Was her name Olga?
No. It was an Italian name. Because she was Italian.
Yeah.
And I met them through not only the work when Nick was at the mill, but also through De Las Yegas, because they were best friends with De Las Yegas.
Right.
Yeah.
And you're thinking of Ed's wife, his first wife.
Yeah.
Because she died and he ended up in a relationship, I think, really later in his life.
Yeah, he did remarry after. I was thinking of the Italian wife. Yeah. Yeah, isn't it funny? And now with Rosa gone, I can't even ask her.
Isn't that, how often do you think of that?
Yeah.
I wished I'd asked my mom this question.
I know. I wish I'd asked my mother questions about some of the baking, traditional baking that was done at Christmas. But I only learned about a couple of things, and she passed away so young. She was just 49 when she got sick and died.
Mm-hmm.
And now I think, gee, why didn't I ask? Or even some of the older Italian ladies, I could have asked them, but, you know, I sometimes, when I can't sleep at night, my mind will race through all the streets on the North End, right up to the highway.
Oh, yeah.
And I can remember people that lived in those houses who have long been gone.
Oh, yeah. Oh, Marilyn, too.
Yeah.
When we walk the streets, she has names that people, I mean, I remember the name, but not like she does.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think of Mr. Heisey, who used to fix watches.
Stan Heisey did all the watches.
Yeah.
I bet you.
I know. Maybe that's what we could do. We could talk another 15 minutes on who we remember. Would you like to do that?
Sure.
Okay,
sure.
We're going to do that. So let's talk about memories, George, because sure. I remember the people that lived on the streets where I grew up on the North End, and you were raised downtown mostly, right? Because you were in the house on 4th.
Yeah, when I moved to Fernie, I would have been 16 or 17 years old. Yeah.
So you have memories of Sparwood.
I have memories of Sparwood. George Fedoric, I think some of the guys, hockey coaches, Mayo Bevilacqua, Hank Brannick.
Those are names even I recognize.
Oh, I'm sure you do, and they were great guys when I was a kid growing up. They're always involved with the kids. Mm-hmm. Yeah, just to name a few.
And what about here in Fernie? Did you have friends that you remembered? Like
yeah,
names?
when I got to Fernie, my brother Staff was dating a Fernie girl from the Bodine family, Anne Bodine, and so he had made a lot of friends here, and I got to meet those guys. So I wound up connected to Blackie Anselmo and Willie Moran. Oh yeah. And Jordy Patterson, and really interesting crew of guys, and got to meet their parents for the most part. Blackie and Reno's mom, Loretta. I spent a lot of time in her house. What a great lady. She had those boys, and it was just a really interesting family to be around. And Willie Moran's dad, Tata, and Willie's mom, spent a lot of time at that house as a kid. Yeah, and that was on First Avenue, because his dad was the CPR foreman, supervisor, so they had a great big house. Yeah. They were actually beyond First Avenue. Yeah, they were right past, right close. Right beside the tracks there. They tore down that house. Behind the Holmes' place. There. Yeah, the CP rail tore down that house. Yeah. But I remember all the old names, and you remembered the one I mentioned, Mr. Heisey, because my father had one of those old watches that always needed repairs. Yeah. And so I was the one that got sent down there to wait for Mr. Heisey to fix this watch and then bring it back home. He fixed a few watches for us too. Another name historically is Len McConaughey. There was no veterinarian around here, but if you had from a sick cat to a sick horse, Len McConaughey was the closest thing to a vet. No and kidding. I don't know. Yeah. I didn't know that. Oh, you didn't know that? No, I didn't, because we had cats, but we didn't have pets that needed. On more than one occasion, our family used Mr. McConaughey. Hmm. Yeah. Do you remember Andrew Lee's? Oh, very, very well. Very well. I bought a pair of binoculars off of Andy Lee's. I won't remember the year. Dale Lucas and I went there. We made a deal, and great pair of binoculars. But I was around Andy a lot. I remember in Andy's older years, he was always involved in shooting sports. He was an excellent marksman.
Oh, I didn't know.
Yeah,
that.
he would come to the Rod and Gun Club. We always had these turkey shoots that we held bi-weekly in the summer, and Andy in his later years would come up. And we had this one event in the shooting was you had to stand offhand and shoot your firearm at 100 yards. And he'd try to find a post so he could lean against the post and hope nobody would be watching so he could rest himself. Andy, I did a fair amount of business with Andy over in West Fernie.
Because he had his traveling truck business.
He had the truck business.
And he sold everything.
He sold everything. He had a storeroom in the basement, upstairs, and in the garage. If you needed anything from a watch to flour, you could get it.
Yeah.
To a gun, you could get it at
everything.
Yeah.
I remember my father buying, that plywood sheets.
Yeah.
Plywood sheets and, building supplies. And my mother would buy spaghetti and tomato sauce. And, at Christmas he would always have the bacala, the salted cod. And those were the days when you could get them this big and this thick. Now, like they're this big and as thin as my finger. Because they just don't come up big like that anymore.
I remember sitting at the kitchen table in Andy's house, and Mrs. Lee's would be around, but when you'd be paying, they'd have the change purse with the zipper, and boy, everything was cash, of course.
Mm-hmm.
And you could get receipts, but it was down to the penny. Those were interesting transactions.
But I don't know if you remember, he always used to say that half of the people that were buried in St. Margaret's Cemetery still owed him money. Because he gave lots of credit during the war years.
Yeah,
and he said afterwards they never paid because some of them moved, some of them died.
I didn't know that, Marianne.
Yeah, he told me that.
Yeah, I sure didn't know that he gave credit because I never ever had any credit with him.
He gave lots of credit when, especially during the war years, because he said he just felt badly for people that they didn't have.
Right.
But he said they didn't have them and didn't pay him. And I can fully understand because I know with my own brother being in business, a lot of people didn't pay him.
Pete?
Joe.
Or Joe,
yeah.
Sorry, Pete.
Pete was my dad.
I worked with your dad.
Yeah.
Yeah. When I came to Fernie when I was a kid, Doug Quayle took over the Quayle's building supplies, and him and Wilda hired me as a kid in the summer, and your dad worked for them.
Yeah.
And I would go with him on jobs. I got to know we had a pretty interesting relationship, your father and I.
He was pretty tough.
You can imagine the age differential there.
Yeah.
And we got along awesome.
Well, as long as you did what he told you.
Oh, you betcha. Yeah. Yeah.
Because I was his #1 helper when he built the house.
Oh, yeah.
And I was terrified of my dad. I was terrified of heights. And I had to go on the, when you go up?
Scaffolding.
Scaffolding.
Yeah.
I've always been afraid of heights. But I was more afraid of my dad. So I went up on those scaffolding and I was one that handed him hammers and whatever tools he needed. Yeah. But Dad knew what he was doing.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Oh, that's interesting. I never knew that you worked with Dad.
Yeah. I never made the connection of you being an ILO or right off the bat, but
yeah, I'm the oldest of the 4 children, so I had to take the place of the boy that, because my parents had a child that was a son that died after 10 days being born.
Oh.
And so then they were so disappointed, but I came along and then another sister came along, so I think my dad had given up hope of ever getting a son, and then my brother came along. Yeah. But that's very interesting that you worked with Dad.
Another West Fernie name just came to mind, Mike Slavins.
Oh, absolutely. Slavins, yes.
He was another Crowsnest Industries.
Yes, really well known.
Well-known guy.
Yeah.
Sawmill guy. My father and him had a very interesting relationship. I would say they were good friends. Anyway, Mike Slavins, somehow he got my father onto the hospital board. I'm not sure how he did it, but he got my father involved in the hospital board. And that was some interesting times too. Yeah, I don't want to speak about some of the things they had to, because there were some legal issues. There were actually doctors that had to get dealt with. And it was very public at the time. But my father was involved in those, and I don't know whether I ever thanked Mike Slavins for getting him involved in that.
Chester.
Yeah,
Dan Chester was also involved with the mill, wasn't he? Or was it with
I think Dan Chester was in the mines.
Was in the mines?
Yeah, I don't remember Chester as a mill guy.
Okay, but that name was really well known.
Ed Backen was a mill guy.
Yeah.
Of course, Mike Slavins was a mill guy. Russ Cornish.
Yes.
Yeah.
You wouldn't have been around. You would have been too young then when the mill was across the 13th, where the city yards are now, or James White owned that mill.
Yeah, I don't remember that. I know of it, but I don't remember it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
But there's some great old names.
Yeah. When thinking back to my Sparwood days, where we lived in Sparwood was called Boss's Row. That's what it was called.
I've heard of it.
And that's the original. That was the original Sparwood. Like the houses went. Ben Sarfini and Lois lived in a house. Then Ed Backen, and then Betty and Buster Dufour, and then Vance and Beth. Not Beth. I'm going to forget Mrs. Hulbert's name. And then the Wilsons. The Hulberts had 9 kids, and we had 9 kids, all around the same age, living side by side.
Wow, it was a lot of activity.
And then Ernie Anderson, and then the McVeys, and then the Henriettes. That was Boss's Row.
Ah,
yeah.
They all lived in one row.
One row of homes. Those are the first homes built in Sparwood.
You know what's amazing is that as a kid going to Natal Michel, it looked like a busy town. It looked bigger than what it was.
Yeah.
And I don't know if it's because there was so much activity going on, people were doing so many events, but when I was a kid, I thought Natal Michel was a big place.
Yeah. Well, it took you a while to drive through it. I mean, when you left Sparwood, you came to the sawmill, and then when you turned the corner of the sawmill, you came into Little Chicago, is what we called it. And then you drove through Little Chicago into Natal. And then you drove into Middletown, and then you drove into Michel. And they were all kind of connected.
So which part was Little Chicago? Because I hear people mentioning that all the time over the years.
Yeah, the Bernardo family lived in Little Chicago, and the Bernardos and the Schmidts, that's another sawmill family. Ida Schmidt and I'm going to forget Mr. Schmidt's first name, but his son was their fire chief, Brian.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, that's where they were. That family was raised, and across the highway was the planer from Little Chicago. But there was residents there. I can't remember families that lived there, but that was part of Little Chicago. And then you moved into Natal.
Those were really interesting times.
Yeah.
Gosh, we could sit here and talk for another hour remembering all of the, all of these names, because I love listening to them. But I certainly appreciate it. Thank you again, George. It's just so great.
Enjoyed it.
Thank you, and thank you for joining us.
Yeah.